This is a lecture on management practices number 3 on the topic of wheat management. This is part of the Agronomy 1 subject, which is a subject that is taught in the Bachelor of Agriculture and Technology and the Bachelor of Equine Studies. These degrees are offered at Melbourne Polytechnic, with the Bachelor of Agriculture and Technology being a partnership with La Trobe University. To find out more about our course and other courses that we offer, please visit our website at www.melbournepolytechnic.edu.au. My name is Dr. Nikki Cooley. In this lecture today we are going to concentrate on the management of wheat, although there are components of this lecture which are relevant to all cereal crops. We are going to start with an introduction to the commercial production of wheat. I'm going to give you a brief overview of both the Australian and the Victorian cropping locations and a little bit about wheat growing in Australia. We will talk extensively about disease management, we will touch on nutrient, water and soil management, and a little bit on tillering and rotation. It is a cereal grain and it is botanically a type of fruit called Coropius. Wheat originates from the Leviot region of Near East. Wheat is in the genus Triticum. Triticum derives from the Latin for thrashing or bruising, and the specific epithet aspitavium is the Latin for summer. Triticum aspitavium is a cultigen, that is, a plant that has been altered by humans through a process of selective breeding, and as such is only known in cultivation. It was first domesticated approximately 9,000 years ago, and its origins have been the subject of intensive botanical and genetic research. It is a member of the grass family, Poaceae, which includes cereals such as rice, maize and oat, and also the ornamentals such as pampas grass and bamboos. The common name for wheat can be bread wheat, common bread wheat, spring wheat, ordinary wheat, common wheat and field wheat. There are about 5,000 cultivars of bread wheat in current use. Historically, about 35,000 cultivars have been developed, but the vast majority of these are no longer cultivated on a commercial scale. If you consider that wheat was first crossed about 9,000 years ago, it is not a surprise that so many cultivars have been generated. Bread wheat is the result of a cross between wild goat grass and a cultivated wheat. Trichium durum is one of the original components of the cross, and it is the tetraploid, whereas Triticum acetium, or the bread wheat, is a hexaploid species. Globally, wheat is a very important cereal grain. It is a staple for about half of the world's population. In 2013, the world production of wheat was estimated at 713 million tonnes, making it the third most produced cereal after maize and rice. In 2003-04, almost 30,000 farmers in Australia grew wheat, using half of the agricultural land dedicated to cropping. There are 29,524 farms in Australia that grow wheat. In Victoria, there are 5,743 farms based on 2006 data from the ABS yearbook. The gross value of production of wheat in 2003-04 was 5.6 billion Australian dollars. This represented 15% of the total farm value production. With overseas sales in 2003-04 of over $3.4 billion, wheat is one of Australia's most valuable exports, making it a significant player in the world wheat market cropping. Wheat is a major winter crop in Australia, with sowing starting in autumn and harvesting following this. Depending on the seasonal conditions, harvesting can occur in either spring or summer. The main producing states in Australia are Western Australia, New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria and Queensland. The average Australian farm size is 443 hectares, with the average farmer in Victoria growing wheat being 245 hectares. Victoria grows about 12% of the total crop in Australia. Victorian farms typically grow about 2.2 tonnes per hectare, which is a little bit above the Australian average at 2 tonnes per hectare. Along with harvest contractors, transport operators, storage handlers, marketers, millers, etc., these people are responsible for the production, sale and distribution of Australia's largest and most valuable crop. Wheat growing areas are determined by a number of factors, but predominate by soil type, soil fertility, topography and rainfall. The image on the slide shows the distribution of wheat in Victoria. The darker colour represents higher wheat production and the very light colours represent land used for non-agricultural purposes. This image was sourced from the Victorian government. In 2005 it was estimated that 1.3 million hectares of wheat were grown in Victoria, and this figure has been stated as rising. The majority of wheat is grown in the northwest of Victoria. The Mallee grows about 101.09 million tonnes over 783,000 hectares. The Wirrama grows 953,000 tonnes over 414,000 hectares. The North Country and North East grow 745,000 tonnes over 275,000 hectares, whereas the Southern Victorian region grows 336,000 tonnes over 140,000 hectares. This data was estimated via the wheat production for Victoria 2011, AGO 548, from the Agricultural Victoria Government website. How did we get to grow wheat in Australia? Well, let's have a brief look at the history. The wheat industry was founded about 2,000 years ago by Governor Phillip. It was founded because the colony wanted to be self-sufficient in food, and Governor Phillip wanted to instigate farming operations, and he chose 9 hectares of land at Farm Cove. This first experiment was not very successful as the soils were too sandy to support the growth of wheat. The operations were moved in November 1788 to about 40 hectares of government farm. This experimental farm was developed and proved to be far more successful. One of the things that Governor Phillip did was to advocate ex-convicts, convicts being farmers. One of these farmers, James Roos, was the first and the best known to develop wheat. By the end of 1790, there were about 200 bushels, which was the unit of measurement then, and that equates to approximately 5.4 tonnes of wheat production. With the opening up of Liberty Plains, now 2 of Western Sydney's suburbs, Homebush and Strathfield, by free settlers, the colony had 6,000 acres under wheat by 1799. Farmers faced many issues like inadequate wheat varieties, labour shortages, lack of appropriate tools and agricultural knowledges. Also infertile soils, poor rainfall and plant diseases. But despite all these challenges, the wheat industry just continued to grow and grow. With the settlement of Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia during the 1830s and 1840s, the cultivation of wheat expanded rapidly to become the industry that it is today. These were based on ABS facts from the 2006 yearbook. There are 2 markets for wheat production: export and domestic. The export market for wheat is by far the largest market for Australia. That is, the majority of Australian wheat is sold overseas, with Western Australia the largest exporting state. The major export markets are in Asia and the Middle East regions and include Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam and Sudan. Australian domestic market, wheat is grown for one of two purposes, that of either human consumption or feedstock. Australia consumes about 5 million tonnes of wheat annually, with the remainder of production being exported. Approximately 2.5 million tonnes are used annually in the production of flour, whole grain products and beer. These are all for human consumption. And in the production of gluten and starch, wheat is used in these industries. A further 2 to 2.5 million tonnes is used annually as stock feed. While this sector of the market is very sensitive to price movements, it is a rapidly growing market in response to an expanding intensive livestock feeding industry. In addition, around 500,000 tonnes of wheat is used for seed production each year. This data is based on the ABS statistics from report 1301-2006. The flour milling industry in Australia was started in the 1870s and there were more than 500 flour mills. These use steam, water or wind as a power source, and most large country towns would have their own flour mill. With improved technology, larger mills have been commissioned, and less overseas demand for mill product now exists. The number of mills in Australia therefore has declined to less than 40. However, with the growth in the Australian population, demand for flour products at home has been steadily increasing. Currently, annual domestic human consumption of flour is about 1.5 million tonnes, and a further 440,000 tonnes of flour is used for industrial purposes such as the production of starch and gluten, which are put into other foods. Of the flour sold for human consumption, just over 60% is used by specialised commercial bread bakers. Wheat has a number of classifications that reflect the quality or composition of the wheat. We will review the markets by their classification later on in this lecture. Different classifications may require different management strategies. In some situations, specific varieties must be used to make the market demands. There are a number of main things to consider when growing wheat. These include location. Does your area get adequate rainfall at the time of sowing through to cropping? Does it have the correct soil characteristics that are required to grow wheat commercially? The markets. What markets are you intending to sell your wheat to? Is it domestic or international? Are you growing your wheat for bread, fodder, noodle production or something else? Variety. What variety are you going to select? The variety selection is really important in the commercial production of wheat, as it enables you largely to optimize your practice. Risk. What are the risks? The biggest risk to commercial production of wheat in Australia would have to be pest and diseases, followed closely by water. Variety selection and the ability to choose varieties that are resistant to certain pest diseases significantly reduce your risk. Nutrient management is another important component to consider when growing wheat. What are your NPK requirements? We will talk about this in some detail later on in the lecture. And finally, What is your infrastructure? In order to enable wheat production, you need to consider infrastructure at sowing, harvest, transport and/or storage. Ideally, you would be close to either a railway station or a shipping area. Wheat breeding has a major contribution to establishing a viable wheat industry in Australia. The breeding of wheat enables a number of varieties to be available for you, the grower, to use. R&D has concentrated on the development of varieties that are resistant to stem rust and leaf rust, both of which prevailed at epidemic levels in the earliest 20th century. Research in this area prevented the ruin of the wheat industry in Australia by the development of breeding. The aim is to breed white grain, medium to high protein wheat varieties suitable for the Australian climate. Recent water efficiency varieties that use less water at certain growing stages and therefore leave more water in the ground that can be used later at the grain forming stage have been popular in the breeding programs. These new breeds have not only reduced water usage but have also achieved major improvements to yields by diverting water usage from vegetation growth to ear production and grain filling. This is known as a change in carbohydrate partitioning. These new varieties are suitable for differing environmental conditions experienced across the wheat belt from Queensland to Western Australia, and these different environmental conditions are significant. In the 1970s and 1980s, there were significant developments to breeding that enabled these high-yielding varieties, which are now available to Australian growers. Australian wheat breeders now use overseas data, including weather, soil and geographical data, to determine how wheat with particular traits are likely to perform in locations across Australia prior to importing the grains for trials. Much of the Australian research is managed by the GRDC. It's important that you get the correct information and that also your information is relevant and up to date. That is, you really want to look at information that has been created in 2015 in order to make your decisions about your 2016 crop. The Department of Agriculture in Victoria is an excellent resource. The following link, also available in your notes, can be used to find out about particular wheat varieties. For example, the first variety in the list that is being published for 2015 is Axe, which is a bred white variety. It is classed as an Australian hard. It has a minimal protein of 11.5%. It can be grown in low rainfall, has an early maturity growing to a short to medium height. Its coleoptile length is short. It is moderately resistant to lodging, that is where the wheat can fall over. Its germination or sprouting is susceptible and very susceptible. The head colour is white and it is horned. It is intolerant to boron and acidity. You can review in Table 2 of this document about the summary for disease resistance for this variety. In fact, there is a suite of additional information about the varieties that are suitable for Victorian growing. I recommend that you take some time after this lecture to review this website and its contents. Disease is a major pressure on the commercial productivity of wheat. We will look in the next section of this lecture in a lot of detail about the diseases of wheat. Typically, the most sensitive part of wheat production is at grain filling, and this typically occurs 4 to 5 weeks after the head emergence. There are 3 components that are required in order for your crop to be infected. These components can be summarized as the disease triangle, and they are shown on the slide. The 3 components are: you require a pathogen, a host, and the environmental conditions need to be ideal. If any one of these components are not present, then you will not get a disease event. I list for your information a table that articulates the major disease of wheat. Please note there are other diseases and this is not inclusive. The diseases are grouped according to the type of disease they are. You can get foliar, soil-borne diseases, or bunts and smuts of cereals. I have also noted the pathogen responsible for each of the diseases on the list. If you suspect a disease on your wheat, then you need to start with the most common diseases first in your identification, as this is the most likely cause of your infection. In order to identify diseases, you need to do your research. You want to first be able to describe the visible disease symptoms. What we mean by this is what is different about the disease plant compared to the normal plants growing in your area. When you are looking at your plant, ensure that you look at every part of the plant. That is, examine the plant, leaves, the stem, the grain, the flowers, and also dig up the plant and have a look at the root. Observe the leaf angle, the colour of the leaf, how hydrated the leaf is. Is there something on the leaf? Do you see spots? Is the area of infection across the leaf? Is it only in the veins, or is it only in the non-vein part called the lamina? Or does the disease occur all over the leaf and plant? If there is an infection site, what shape is the infection site and what colour it is? If you are able to take a picture or describe each and all of these components, it will help you in the identification of the disease. It is very important to note the phenological stage of your plant. Understand if rainfall has been typical for the time of year. Is it average, is it low, or is it high? Because this information will also enable you to determine the disease. You should also look at temperature data. Is it warmer than normal, average temperatures, or cooler than normal? And finally, you should research what diseases are common for your area and/or your time of year. Once you have all this information, you are in a good position to attempt the identification of your disease. You can then match your disease identification with the specific disease cycle. It is very important to see at what point your disease is in. This aids significantly with your ability to manage the disease. There are many resources available about management. Victoria Disease Summary on Wheat in 2015 can be found in your notes. I have copied this information directly from the Agriculture and Victoria Government website, and I hope that you will read this and become familiar with how 2015 saw changes to yellow leaf spot, rust, blotch, some bunts and smuts, and also some prevalence of some root disease. The most common diseases of wheat in Victoria are stem and leaf rust, so I will spend a little bit of time looking at both of these. When the disease is on the leaf, it is called a foliar disease. In the paddock, infection can be mostly across a crop. It can start as a hot spot or foci of infection in the paddock, from which the disease will rapidly spread if the conditions are favourable and the wheat variety is susceptible. On the plant, that you will see small circular or ovule pustules that are orange to light brown dusty spores on the upper surface of the leaves and on the leaf sheaths in the cases of heavy infection. Leaf rust spores are confined chiefly to the upper surface of the leaf and rarely appear on the back of the leaf except in seedlings. Pustules that go through the leaf surface to the back are more typical of stem rust. Impacts of rust are most severe if there is a significant infection established on the plant around 4 to 5 weeks after the head of grain has emerged. The mode of action for yield reduction by foliar diseases is caused by reducing the capabilities of a number of biological functions of the plant. These include reductions in photosynthetic rate, thereby the plant producing less assimilates or sugars. There is a reduction to translocation of the photosynthetic materials. What this means is there is a reduced amount of sugar that is moved around the plant. And finally, the last mode of action by this disease is an increase in respiration. The problem with increasing respiration is that it increases the cost of energy for the plant. Therefore, there is less energy available to enabling growth and grain filling than would otherwise be ideal. The combination of impacts of these physiological processes in the plant is to reduce the grain size. Please note this is different from reducing the number of grains. This leads to increased screenings and also lower yields. Research conducted by Paverley and Clark in 2000 illustrates that yield can be reduced by up to 220% in the ear, 43% in the flag leaf. 23% of reductions can be found in the second leaf, that is the second leaf from the top of the plant, while 7% reductions in leaf 3 and a mere 3% reduction in leaf 4. You will observe from these data that the youngest leaves are the more susceptible to these kinds of diseases. Wheat in this research was shown to be more sensitive than barley. Wheat foliar diseases can be significantly influenced by the environment. The environment includes the weather, the temperature, frost, wind, water. Water in both the sense of rainfall and humidity. An example of how the environment can influence. If the temperature range for lead rust is between 10 and 35 degrees C, with the optimal temperature between 15 to 25 degrees C, with a leaf wetness of 3 hours or more and a latent period of 7 to 10 days, with spore dispersal enabled by wind, you will get a high prevalence of the disease where plants are susceptible. Soil type is very important to not only the ability for the wheat plant to grow, but also for the foliar disease prevalence. The wrong soil type can add to the susceptibility of a disease. This is because soil type can lead to poor aeration or drainage. Some duplex soils that are found in Victoria, for example, may lead to very shallow soils, and this impacts on disease prevalence. Soil pH can lead to an imbalance in nutrient availability and plant uptake. This can also make the plant more susceptible because it doesn't have the nutrients it requires. Saline soils can also impact on disease prevalence too. I cannot stress how important it is to do your research on disease susceptibility, because disease susceptibility can be transient. What we mean by this is it can change over time and it can change in areas. Therefore, you need to keep up to date. Use your local government site, for example, Victoria Government, and regularly check how the recommendations for each variety have changed. When you are doing your research about your wheat varieties, One of the components you will come across is disease ratings. So I'm going to spend a moment here reviewing the various disease ratings. The best variety is one that is defined as resistant, which is abbreviated in the tables usually to an R. Probably the worst variety from a disease perspective is that of very susceptible and VS. In between resistant and very susceptible, there are various levels. It is important to articulate the various levels. If you have a variety that is defined as resistant, moderately resistant, or resistant to moderately resistant, the chances are that if an outbreak or the conditions for an outbreak were favourable, you wouldn't have to manage the disease, but you probably would have to look at it and review it often to ensure the disease didn't take hold. If your variety sits between moderately resistant to moderately susceptible, then you would have to both monitor it carefully, and you may have to look at an economic reduction to your yield. This will depend on how susceptible or resistant your variety is. For example, a moderately susceptible or MS variety in seasons where the disease is likely to be observed and symptoms can be detected on inspection, you can expect losses of up to 15%. The last scale is that from susceptible to very susceptible, and these are really varieties that you don't want to grow if you know these particular diseases occur in this area. For susceptible diseases, you can have a crop loss of between 15 to 50%. If your variety is defined as very susceptible and you have an outbreak of this disease, you can expect an entire crop to be lost. An integrated approach to disease management is regarded as best practice. We have a subject in the degree that enables you to learn a lot more about integrated approaches for disease and pest management. Let us look at an example of a wheat disease, leaf rust. In order for you to implement an integrated approach, you must have an understanding of the disease prevalence, that is, what conditions lead to an outbreak. But also you must have an in-depth knowledge of the disease pathology. Resistant varieties are perhaps one of the most useful tools in management. There are other components or things that you can do, for example, the removal of self-sown susceptibility. You can do this by grazing heavily or by using herbicides in the autumn. Seed treatments. Suppress early infection. If you do have a foliar disease, then you should look at chemical control. There are a number of foliar fungicides available on the market. It is important that you get up-to-date information, as foliar fungicides can change because sometimes diseases form resistance against certain chemicals. You should also look very closely at the timing of the spraying of any foliar fungicides, as this is essential to how effective they may or may not be. As a plant germinates and then grows, it goes through a number of phenological stages. These phenological stages can be assessed or quantified. This is called plant phenological assessment. There are a number of keys depending on the species you are trying to assess. The Zodox et al. 1974 scale is most often used for cereal growth stages and one that I would recommend you use. The scale ranges from 1 to 93. Often in Australian plant production, water is considered to be an important limiting component to optimal yields and profits. The growing of wheat is no exception to this. Therefore, understanding your rainfall and your water use efficiency are very important. According to the ABS data in 2006, the average minimal rainfall for commercial wheat production was between 400 and 600 millimeters per year. It is not only important that you get rain, but that a rain occurs between winter and spring. Wheat has a potential water use of efficiency of approximately 20 kilograms per meter per hectare. Water use efficiency is a scale that enables you to compare how efficient a plant can use water. Weeds can suppress yield, so therefore weed management is important to maximize your potential yields. Weed management is something that you have to start planning early, long before you plant your crop. Winter clearing of pastures is highly recommended as part of your weed management. The control of grass weeds in broadacre crops can be used by chemicals or fallowing. Control can also be used by applying herbicide options, but you need to identify correctly your weed and your correct herbicide to match this, depending on what your main problems are. Rotations are very important in weed control too. If you are unsure about weed management, you can get advice from the government departments or some cropping advisors. Early on, we touched on the importance of soils. And certainly when you look at nutrient management and how to optimize this in wheat, you need to consider soils. It is best practice to conduct regular soil tests on your paddocks. Once you understand what nutrients are in your soils, you can best apply the nutrient requirements for your plant. Some important components to consider are pH, texture, and the water holding capacity of your soil. Once you understand what your soil is lacking, you can then add the appropriate nutrient to match your plant requirements. The timing of application is essential. Please refer to the lecture on nutrient management and on soils for more information on this area. Assumed in this lecture, you will apply the general principles of nutrient and soil management, but in the next couple of slides I will detail some specificities about wheat. For the successful growth of wheat, you need to consider both yield and the protein content of the grain. Therefore, nitrogen is a very important component of your nutrient management. You need to consider when to apply. In a typical crop, 3 tons per hectare of crop at 11% of protein requires about 62 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. It is best practice to determine what you want your yield to be and your protein content, and then work backwards to how much nutrients you should apply. There are several ways you can get this information, but one is a commercially available nitrogen calculator by PRSA and CSIRO. This calculates nitrogen budgets and estimates nitrogen requirements. The link on the slide from the GRDC gives you a breakdown of nitrogen requirements. Please take some time after this lecture to read this document. You need to understand the pattern of nitrogen uptake during the growing seasons in order to optimize the timing of your nitrogen applications. You must always remember nitrogen cycling, and so match your environmental conditions, i.e. ideally close to rain, when you apply your nitrogen. Phosphorus is another important component for successful commercial production of wheat. Adequate phosphorus availability in the soil is essential at the early growth of wheat. Most Victorian soils are low in available phosphorus, and much of the crop requirement will need to be supplied through the application of fertilisers at the time of sowing. Therefore, paddock history of phosphorus application and crop yields is important, and you should use this information ideally in conjunction with soil test results. Study the economics of the application with determine the rates required along with the profits that you will get. A rule of thumb of requirement is that 3 kilograms per hectare of available phosphorus for each tonne of wheat that you hope to obtain. The application is then adjusted in the light of soil test results. We have mentioned previously in this lecture the importance of the market that you are growing your wheat for. Now we will look at specific classifications for markets. We will start with an overall production of wheat and then look specifically at the Victorian markets. In the table on your slide, you will see a number of classifications. For example, APH stands for Australian Prime Hard. This is for human consumption, and it is a wheat that has a minimal protein level of 13%. Australian Standard White, ASW, is a wheat grown to make white bread. ASWN, Australian Standard Noodle, is a wheat grown for the production of noodles where the protein is around 9.2 to 11%. A higher grade of noodle has a protein of 10 to 11.5%, and this is the Australian Premium Noodle. Some grain is grown for feed for animals, and this is called Australian Feed, or FEED. These descriptions are from the Department of Victorian Agriculture. One of the major grain marketers in Australia is the AWB. The Cargill is Australia's grain or original business with a network of about 40 grain markets across 26 locations located through the Australian grain belt. It is a major marketer of Australian wheat and oilseeds that is supplied for crush plants and for flour milling. And I'm going to use their classifications in the next few slides to summarise the Victorian market. Classification Prime Hard Wheat is a wheat that is used for Japanese and Chinese noodles. It enables high volume breads, and it has a minimum protein of between 13 and 14% and is grown in Victoria. The classification Hard is a wheat that is used for European pan and half breads, Middle East flatbreads and Chinese steamed products. This has a minimum protein value of 11.5%. White wheat is a medium to low protein grain. It is a multi-purpose wheat and is used in the Indian and Middle East flatbread markets as well as the Chinese steam breads. Australian general purpose wheat and feed wheat is often referred to as GP1. It fails to meet higher grading. It is used for high protein. It is rich in gluten, which also helps binding in pellet production for animal feed. Cropping systems are something that you want to consider when growing your wheat. Are you going to use a traditional cropping system? Are you going to employ direct drill with no-till, beds and pasture cropping? Practice is that you don't grow the same crop year after year. Therefore, enterprises tend to be a mix. This will enable you to optimize and lower your risk, which is very important. It also enables some disease control. We found that when you mix enterprises, the effect is synergistic. There is lower risk of price fluctuations. You have lower costs up front. You can be more flexible and increase in resilience. There is an increase in marketing and product options available to you, and therefore an increase in opportunities. It is often said that the best farmers are those that are able to change when the market requires such change, and having an enterprise mix will certainly put you in a good position for this philosophy. Many critical risks to cropping and cropping of wheat, but let us consider some major ones. Frosts at the wrong time can be an issue for wheat production. Droughts also can be a significant problem for wheat production, particularly if water available is low at germination and at grain filling. Hailstorms have known to reduce, if not flatten, crops and therefore reduce the economic return. Late rain can cause lodging, also a problem to the crops. Extreme unseasonal heat in the wintertime can also cause problems to Victorian wheat cropping. I have not looked at market risks here, only the environmental ones. And governance in wheat in Australia play a significant role in the commercial production of wheat. These can be across a number of areas. For example, in the past, the Commonwealth and state governments have provided the wheat industry with financial assistance by guaranteeing minimal prices to growers and investments in storage and handling of wheat. They also enable regulatory control in the form of restrictions on the sale of wheat. Governments still have regulatory role in the marketing of export wheat, but no longer provide subsidies to growers and have diversified their involvement in storage, handling and transport of wheat. Governments at both Commonwealth and state levels have also contributed significantly to agricultural research through state-based government research organisations, universities, and through the Grain and Research Development Corporation, or GRDC, as well as CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industry Research Organisation. They have enabled research into management, disease, water and nutrients, all attempting to optimise these for the growth of wheat in Australia. I have stated through this lecture that it is important to do your research and do your research annually. One of the important wheat resources I'd like to direct you to now is the Victorian Government of Agriculture. Please follow the link on your slide after this lecture and read pages 8 to 24 of this document and insert relevant notes and information here. This is part of your lecture notes. In this lecture, you will now be able to articulate how important wheat is to the world and commodities in both Australia and the state of Victoria. I hope you now can articulate and describe the many management components that one has to consider when growing wheat commercially. It is important to remember that you are often growing wheat for not only a yield but quality components, and both of these factors will influence how you manage the wheat. It is very important in your management to concentrate particularly on disease and disease pressures, as well as water, and to a slightly lesser extent, that of nutrients. That brings us to the end of this lecture on wheat management.